Hello, this is a video on the Fiscal Policy, which is part of Economics A2 level Unit 4. The government's budget basically takes into account all of the stuff coming into the government, sort of money through taxation primarily, and all the money going out of the government, so it's spending on hospitals, healthcare, education, that sort of thing. And there's different states that the budget can be in, so it can be balanced. So if the amount that the government's getting in is equal to the amount that it's pushing out, that's a balanced budget. It's got no sort of fiscal stance, it's just everything's equal. Whereas if we've got a deficit or a surplus, there's sort of changes that can occur, so they can have an impact on aggregate demand. So if we're spending more than we're taking off the people, we're essentially increasing aggregate demand within the economy. This sort of has an expansionary approach. This tends to increase economic growth and employment, although it can have negative effects on inflation. If we've got this inflation and we want to try to reduce it, you often use a contractionary fiscal stance, which is when you're spending less than you're taking off the people. So people who've got less disposable income, they're spending less, demand falls. This takes pressure off prices and they tend to fall too, so that reduces the inflationary pressure, though it can have negative effects on growth and employment. I think my art abilities have reached a new low. I can't even tell what that's meant to be. So why does the government tax people? It's not entirely because they're greedy and want a pay rise. There are actually a few other objectives of taxation. So funding, spending. Essentially, we can't spend on education and healthcare if we don't have any money. And so to get money, we need other people to pay in. So if we take a bit of money off everybody, we can put the money where it's needed in sort of education, defence. I think there's 6 main areas of spending. Education, healthcare, the justice system, policing, defence. I think that might go with policing. Social security, and paying off debts, so debt interest. That's our areas of spending, and we can't spend unless we have money. Next, managing the economy. This is essentially what we said before to do with fiscal stance and aggregate demand. Obviously, higher taxes will reduce inflation, lower taxes will encourage employment and economic growth. Obviously, taxation at different levels can have impacts on trade of other countries, but I think we'll look at that another time. Even if we do, we might. Income redistribution, essentially to do with the Robin Hood effect, taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. So we can have progressive taxation and transfer payments in order to take the money from people who might have more money and give it to people that need it, who are unable to earn it for themselves. So some of this will be for unemployed people, and some of this might be for disabled people and that sort of thing. And then finally, correcting market failure. So remember all that stuff you did last year in Unit 1? It's basically this stuff again. So it's reducing negative externalities through taxing demerit goods. That would be probably the main objective of taxation of that kind. So tax on cigarettes, excise duty, that sort of thing. I think there's been changes recently to taxation on alcohol in the budget, but I think it was like 1p off the price of a pint of beer or something. There are 2 main types of taxation, direct and indirect. Direct taxation is tax on income, tax on profits, that sort of thing. These tend to be progressive, so the more money you have, the more tax you pay, which is why there's different bands of income tax for different people. They're relatively inflexible because you can't choose whether to pay them or not. I mean, if you don't want to pay it, you just either have to move country or not do the work, which is why they've got a disincentive effect, because people can often be put off doing extra hours if they think, oh, I'm going to have to give 50% of the money I earn for that away. And then that's obviously lack of choice. People can't choose whether or not to pay without literally moving. I mean, you have a lot of people who move countries to avoid paying tax, so we're losing massive amounts of money through this. But if we don't have these direct taxes, then we have to increase indirect taxes, which is tax on spending, and a lot of people don't like this because they tend to be regressive taxes, because the amount of money that, say we've got 2 people buying a football, a richer person and a poorer person, the extra tax on the football will be the same for everybody, but that, say it was 10p, the 10p from a richer person is a lot smaller percentage of their income than the 10p for the poorer person. So indirect taxes tend to take a much higher proportion of a poorer person's income than a richer person's. They also tend to be inflationary since they push prices up and can lead to a black market because people think, oh, I'm not going to pay that tax on cigarettes. I'm going to buy them from, I don't know, Lenny, who's selling them. Don't know why Lenny would be selling them. Pretty sure George shot him. Anyway, plot spoiler there. Also, indirect taxes, positives, people can choose whether or not to pay them. You don't want to pay tax on a football? Don't buy a football. Though obviously this links back to the regressive thing. The disincentive for the football is going to be much greater for a poorer person than a rich person. So a rich person is much less likely to think, oh, I don't want to pay that tax, I'm not going to buy the football. Also, they can be used to correct externalities, negative externalities, as we looked at before with cigarettes and stuff. So that's quite a good one. And then it can influence spending patterns. So if the government wants people to spend more money on a certain thing, they might reduce taxes on it. They want people to spend less money on a thing, they'll increase taxes. The principles of taxation, I just looked at this actually. There's 2 C's, 3 E's and an F, and that might be a good way to sort of remember them, get them in your head. I often find if I can remember the first letter of things, I can work out what they go with. So we've got economical, equitable, convenient, certain, efficient and flexible. Taxes should be economical. This means they should be cheap to collect, so as little as possible of the tax revenue is lost on collections of tax. So forms and stuff should be cheap, they should be not expensive, and we shouldn't have to spend loads of money on sending the taxman out to collect taxes, that sort of thing. Equitable means that taxes should be based on the taxpayer's ability to pay. So horizontal equity means that people and firms with the same income should pay the same amount of tax. And then we've got vertical equity, which means that the amount that people and firms pay should be based on their ability to pay. You can sort of think of that as a straight line and a horizontal line. So a straight line could be in either direction. I meant horizontal and vertical. So horizontal equity, if we've got a sort of graph of income, so we've got income on the y-axis, I don't know what's on the x-axis, but income's on the y-axis, and anyone that's on the same point on that y-axis should be paying the same amount. Whereas if you're at different points on the y-axis, you should pay an amount equivalent to your ability to pay, so that would be the vertical equity amount. Convenient basically means that payment and timing should be convenient to the taxpayer, so people should be taxed after they've been given their income. They should be taxed at a time that's okay. They need to have a certain amount of time in which they can get the funds together for their taxing, so there shouldn't be like a, here's your tax form, give me the money the next day sort of thing. And that goes alongside certain, so taxpayers should be very clear about how the system works, when they're going to be taxed, that sort of thing. And taxes should also be very difficult to evade, because the government loses a lot of revenue every year from... Oh, my tea's disgusting, I've dropped my bourbon in it. Yeah, anyway, government loses lots of money every year from people that are avoiding taxes. So if we can try to make it as hard as possible for people to evade taxes, we can maximise government revenue. Efficient, so essentially taxes should be as little as possible. They should act as disincentive to work and invest. So obviously with progressive taxation right at the top band, you've got a disincentive effect. People don't want to work the extra hours because they think, well, I'm just going to lose all my money anyway. So as much as possible we should try to restrict this sort of negative distortion, this disincentive. And finally, flexible. We want taxes to be very easy to alter dependent on economic circumstances. We don't want there to be any sort of difficulty in changing taxes about, so the faster that we can change taxes, the better. Hypothecation is when taxes are sort of earmarked for a specific purpose, and the one I can think of off the top of my head would be cigarette. Tax on cigarettes, a lot of the money collected from that cigarette tax will go to people with lung cancer as a result of smoking, that sort of thing. I just went to see if the textbook had a different example, and they've got the same one. So another one that you might have, trying to think off the top of my head, road tax. Money that people pay to use the road tends to be used to repair the road, that sort of thing. Then we have benefit principle, so taxes should be linked to the benefits that are received by the taxpayer. So essentially the only people that pay the tax should be the people that are benefiting. So fuel tax, for example, only people that are driving cars pay fuel tax because only those people are getting the advantage of having bought the fuel, that sort of thing. Also, taxes can be used to correct negative externalities. Here are 3 different areas of government expenditure. So we have capital expenditure, which is spending to improve the productive capacity of the nation. Obvious one for that is going to be education and training. So if we spend more on improving the sort of skills of the workforce, we're going to have a more productive workforce. Current expenditure is government spending on the running of the public sector. So public sector workers' wages is the big one for that. We spend an awful lot of money on that each year, but obviously it's good because we are paying them that because they're getting us more through what they're doing. Also raw materials that people in the public sector might be using, maybe computers that they're using, that sort of thing. And finally, transfer payments, which is payments to individual for essentially no gain. So state benefits, that sort of thing. If we're paying people because they're disabled and they can't work for themselves, that's a transfer payment. Job seekers allowance, anything like that. You can actually use taxation and government spending to affect aggregate demand in the economy, although a lot of people are sort of against this because it's not massively precise and there can be quite big time lags of any changes. But if we are sort of being able to affect the level of aggregate demand in the economy, we can increase sort of stability, so we've got less unemployment with fluctuations and that sort of thing. If we have got a sort of downturn, we can try to boost demand in the economy. It's not always effective due to underconfidence, so even if people have more money, they tend to save it because they're worried they're going to lose their job. But we can try to sort of increase demand, and then when demand is too high and we've got inflation, we can put up taxes and this can sort of reduce these inflationary pressures. Then we have automatic stabilisers, and these sort of happen automatically with fluctuations. So when we've got high unemployment, we're going to have an automatic rise in benefits expenditure, and then when we've got low unemployment, we're going to have an automatic fall in benefits expenditure, that sort of thing, which is sort of the opposite of deliberate or active fiscal policy, which is when we make deliberate changes in order to impact the economy. So, for example, if we have got high unemployment, we might deliberately cut income tax in order to encourage people to spend in order to boost demand and push up employment, that sort of thing. There are two main types of budget deficit. We've got our cyclical budget deficit, which is when there's changes in the economic cycle. So say we had a fall in GDP, this is going to lead to a worsened budget deficit because we're going to have a fall in sort of employment, so we're going to have to spend more on benefits and we're going to get less in on income tax. But we could have a fall in the budget deficit, say we had a rise in GDP, because that'll have the opposite effect. Then we have a structural budget deficit, which happens when there's changes in the structure of the economy. For example, deindustrialisation, the big one there, obviously closing of the mines. We're going to lose a lot of workers there because they used to work in the mines, now they're unemployed, so that's going to increase our deficit. Or we could have something like a socio-economic factor, like the growth in single-parent families. Single-parent families, they tend to have higher levels of unemployment because they can either look after their child or pay for childcare, and it tends to be cheaper for them to look after the child. So anything like that can have an impact on the budget deficit. I actually did a whole essay on childcare last year. It was quite interesting to look at the different impacts of policies, and it was particularly to do with taxation and tax breaks for working mothers, that sort of thing. The public sector net cash requirement, otherwise known as the PSNCR, is the difference between government spending and government revenue. And if we're spending more than we're getting in from taxes, we might have to finance this through borrowing from the banking sector, which would be the Bank of England, high street banks, that sort of thing, and then the non-bank sort of private sector, which would be insurance companies and individuals. This is kind of unlikely to come up, but it's kind of interesting. If we've got a negative PSNCR, so our tax revenue is higher than the amount that we're spending, we'll be able to repay past debt. So we've got a budget surplus, we've got more money than we need, so we're mainly going to be spending this on paying back debt interest and hopefully paying back the debt itself. Over time, ideally, you'll sort of have a cycle, so sometimes you'll be positive and sometimes you'll be negative, but they'll balance each other out in the end. The budget deficit isn't all bad. There are actually some benefits of having a budget deficit, especially depending on what you're spending on. So if we are spending the money on capital equipment and that sort of thing, capital spending to boost the future capacity of the economy, whilst we may be spending more in the short term, in the long term, hopefully we can have a continuous budget surplus because we're going to have sort of lots of money coming in through income tax and higher sort of employment figures, that sort of thing. Also tends to be a stimulus to growth simply because if we're spending more than we're taking in, aggregate demand tends to be rising. So that's one benefit. And also just demand management in general. So if we're boosting aggregate demand, we can have less risk of a negative output gap. So you can sort of draw your aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram, and any right shift in aggregate demand will reduce the gap between capacity and actual production. Unfortunately, there are quite a few problems with having a budget deficit, and the big one is obviously financing. So the amount of national debt we're in fact, on our economics classroom, there's this figure for the amount of personal debt each person in Britain has, and it is a crazy amount of debt due to the amount that we've been borrowing in order to finance our budget deficit. And obviously, when we're borrowing, we don't only have to pay that money back, but we also have to pay interest, and this can be quite a lot of money. And any payment that we have to make to repay this debt is leakage from the circular flow of income, which reduces aggregate demand and can lead to sort of a slowdown. So we have to think about the opportunity cost of future repayments whenever we borrow money. There's also this phenomenon called fiscal crowding out. So when we've got high debt, we're going to have to repay this debt through increasing taxes and that sort of thing, which again reduces aggregate demand. I just got distracted by some fun facts about mean girls on Tumblr. But anyway, back to the Code for Fiscal Stability. What is the golden rule? This is that net government borrowing should only be for infrastructure projects. Obviously, the big one that everyone's probably thinking of is HS2 at the moment. I think UKIP wants to put an end to HS2, but I'm not going to give political opinions. Golden rule. So yeah, basically we're not going to spend it on benefits and that sort of thing. It should only be for infrastructure projects, for building projects, rather than essentially you're meant to actually avoid using fiscal stuff to impact aggregate demand, which is the bottom one there. So you're not really meant to use fiscal policy to affect demand. It's meant to be primarily to do with infrastructure projects, although they in themselves can impact aggregate demand because they tend to have a high multiplier effect. So say we employ 20 workers to build HS2, I think that might be slightly ambitious, but anyway, if you're hiring 20 workers to do the building itself, because of all the safety regulations, the manufacturing of the bits that they need to build HS2, that sort of thing, we tend to employ a lot more than just the 20 people. There's so many behind the scenes people that we're also employing, so that tends to boost aggregate demand in itself. But anyway, that's the golden rule for you. They also want to make everything really sustainable, so sustainable investment. So public sector debt over the economic cycle should never exceed 40% of GDP, because obviously that could be very hard to pay back and lead to lots and lots of debt interest and horrible stuff like that. We've already touched on the fact that fiscal policy shouldn't really be used for demand management, which is weird because that goes against everything that we were taught, like at GCSE and that sort of thing. It's mainly meant to be used for infrastructure projects. Governments are actually increasing the number of stealth taxes that they're using. So these are taxes that they hope are going to go unnoticed. So, for example, if you did put up the price of beer by 1p, it's actually gone down by 1p. But say you put it up 1p, they might think no one's going to notice that, but we're going to get extra revenue. So there tends to be a rise in the number of stealth taxes that government are putting on. Now let's look at the microeconomic effects of fiscal policy. Don't worry, this is the last slide. So we've got our incentives and our disincentives. So say we've got Fred. Fred's a worker. Income tax is going to fall. Fred thinks, woohoo, I'm going to work more because the government's going to take less of my money away, so I can work more and I'll get more of my earnings, that sort of thing. But unfortunately, income tax might also rise, and then Fred might think, oh no, I don't want to work anymore because I'm giving away so much of my money. And then he might stop working, and that's the poverty trap. So if you earn more by not working. So that was the incentive and disincentive with Fred from, I don't even know where that accent was from. Pattern of demand can be affected. So subsidies can increase demand for merit goods, taxes can decrease demand for demerit goods. Also, if we think about elastic goods, these tend to be affected much more by subsidies and taxes than inelastic goods, because say cigarettes, they're relatively inelastic. People are going to buy them no matter what the price is because they're addicted to them. Whereas if we think of something that's more price elastic, maybe fast food tends to be slightly more price elastic. If we do increase tax on fast food, people are more likely to turn away from it, although I think it's still pretty inelastic, but not quite as inelastic as cigarettes. Sorry, my voice has actually gone really annoying, so sorry about that. Business investment is the final thing. So say we reduce corporation tax, people are going to think, oh, we can spend more of our profits on investment, maybe in research and development and that sort of thing. So if we have low corporation tax, it's good for local companies and even national companies within the country, but also it's good for attracting external foreign direct investment, so investment in the UK by foreign multinational companies, because they think, low taxes here, we may as well base our factories here and do work here because we have to pay less, that sort of thing. I think if you're doing a macroeconomic question, these microeconomic effects can be more of a sort of side notion, evaluative measure that you could put into place, and they're sort of things that you'd follow through of your own accord, so you might not want to bother even learning these. You just think about them on the day when you're writing your essay, think, look at this, what impact is this going to have on a smaller scale, and then you can always look at the larger scale of the smaller scale. So we've got more investment is a component of aggregate demand, so you can look at the macroeconomic effect of aggregate demand, that sort of thing. Woo, that's the end of the fiscal policy. You'll be glad to know that the supply side policy has literally got 2 slides of content, so it should be like a 5-minute video compared to this monster, which is like 20 minutes long. That's a long video. If you've made it here, then go have a cookie. Congratulate yourself for making it this far, listening to my particularly annoying voice of the day. Anyway, yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video and that it's helped. See you next time. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.